This is Richard Wolff with another response to an AskProfWolff question coming from our Patreon community. And this one comes from Robert Tompkins. And Robert asks about the behavior of the large banks in the United States particularly, and he wonders whether the stagnation of workers' incomes that starts in the 1970s and has never stopped, a situation that means if you adjust the money wage workers get for the prices workers have to pay, then the real wage, that's what that means in terms of what the wage can actually buy, is not much different today than what it was in the late 1970s. An amazing end of 150 years of rising real wages, where the wages you got enabled you to buy more and more things. All of that stopped. Real wages stagnated since the 1970s. And Robert Tompkins asks, is that when banks started doing other things, investing their money in much more risky ways, leading to the very instability, etc., that we suffer now? Well, I think the best honest answer to the question is you're half right and you're half not so right, but you're mostly right. And let me explain. When the American working class's real wages stop rising in the 1970s, it comes to them as a shock. Very important to understand. And it's a shock for a good reason. The American working class, for the 150 years before the 1970s, had experienced decade after decade rising real wages. Yes, prices went up, but the wages they earned went up more. So at the end of each 10-year period, working class families were able to buy and consume more than they had at the beginning of each decade. Genuine, rising, real incomes, real consumption. It was one of the best records any working class in any capitalist country between 1820 and 1970 could show. And it led to Americans believing they lived in a charmed country, American exceptionalism, that somehow God smiled on the United States to give the working class a rising standard of living. And it was a factor that blunted, sometimes, not always, the appeal of socialism and other criticisms of capitalism, because the capitalists could and did come back by saying to the working class, you don't need socialism, you don't want socialism, you don't need labor unions, you don't want labor unions, because look, your standard of living is going up. Didn't work all the time, as it shouldn't have, but it was an argument. All of that stopped in the 1970s, and the banks did react to the end of rising real wages. And their reaction took a particular form. They made the determination that the American working class was being and would continue to be traumatized by the end of rising real wages, shocked that they would blame themselves that their wages didn't rise, rather than talking about a system that had broken down for them. But they didn't. By that time, the socialist left in the United States had been largely destroyed by McCarthyism, by the Cold War, and so on. So working class families were kind of left on their own. What did they do when their wages didn't go up? Did they give up on the American dream of a rising standard of living? No, they did not. So they did two things. Number one, if your wages per hour don't go up, do more hours. Working men and women took on more hours of work, a second job, a part-time job, a weekend job. You understand. But the second thing is where the banks come in. The second thing the American working class family was willing to do, and this was with great difficulty, they set aside the traditions of thrift, of saving, that had been preached in every American church, synagogue, that had been taught to children in school. Save your money. Don't spend everything. Always put aside for a difficult time, for a rainy day. Don't spend it all. It's unwise. The American working class put that advice aside. It was difficult. It was frightening. But they did. And you know what they were willing to do with enormous promotion from the banks? They were willing to go into debt. So yes, the banks responded to stagnating real wages, but they did so in a way that was good for them. They went to the working class with a vengeance and said, "We have what you need, a credit card. We will give you loans. Just use the card, go into the store, and hand them your card, and in the moment that they put the card in the little machine, a loan is organized." That's what it is. The merchant you're buying from is immediately given a sum of money that is added to your personal debt, which you find out about at the end of the month on the statement. The banks went into what is euphemistically called consumer services. It's called ripping off the public, taking advantage of the working class's desire to hold on to the American dream, the only way that was left to them when their wages didn't go up, and that was by borrowing. And over the last 40 to 50 years, banks have made a fortune off of this, let's be honest, enforced lending debt of the working class. First, they gave them all credit cards. Then they gave them all loans to buy their cars. Then they gave them all loans to pay for the educations for their children. Debt, 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 debt. And then the banks came up with clever ways to package the debts into a new kind of security called a derivative, to let investors get in on the action of fleecing the working class because you'd stopped raising their wages. Yes, banks went into very risky maneuvers on top of a mound of profitability found in the debts of the working class. Once again, capitalism figured out how to take advantage of the working class to produce mountains of profit, and along the way, huge vulnerabilities to crashes, to costly bailouts. We're living through those. But that's how capitalism works. So yes, Robert Tompkins, the banks did become more risk takers, but they did so on the backs of the mass of the working class, who had to go into debt to even fantasize the ability to give themselves and their children the American dream they had been promised. This is Richard Wolff for AskProfWolff, in appreciation of our Patreon community.